Was it the silence that amplified the ticking of the grandfather clock, or did the silence itself emanate from the steady, relentless tock-tock that measured out Park Min-jun's 73rd year? He sat, spine straight as habit demanded though fatigue pulled at his shoulders, in his study within the quiet heart of Bukchon Hanok village. Sunlight, pale gold in the late autumn afternoon, slanted through the paper-covered lattice window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, and the precise stacks of books lining the walls, monuments to a life dedicated to Korean literature, now gathering their own quiet layers of history. Outside, the muffled sounds of Seoul, a distant siren, the growl of a bus, seemed a world away from the hushed courtyard of his traditional Hanok. His world had shrunk to these wooden beams, these paper walls, this ordered silence. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, the motion precise, almost mechanical. His thinning grey hair, meticulously combed hours ago, remained undisturbed. A retired professor, his days followed a script written long ago. Wake, simple breakfast, read, perhaps a short, solitary walk within the familiar alleys, lunch, more reading or organising notes that no one would ever consult, dinner, evening news, sleep. It was a life of curated solitude, a fortress built against the chaotic tides of modern life, and if he were honest, which he rarely was, even with himself, against the echoing emptiness left by his wife, Yoon-hee, 2 years gone. His gaze drifted to the dark screen of his laptop. Soon. Ji-hoon, his son, lived in Toronto, swallowed by a different time zone, a different life. Their weekly video calls were rituals of strained politeness, exchanges of curated information that felt like reports rather than conversations. Ji-hoon would show fleeting images of his life, his job, his apartment, sometimes a blurry glimpse of the grandchild Min-jun barely knew. Min-jun would inquire about the weather, nod at Ji-hoon's brief answers, and offer pronouncements on Korean politics that Ji-hoon received with polite detachment. The connection flickered, fragile as the Wi-Fi signal that sometimes dropped. The laptop chimed. Ji-hoon's face appeared, framed by the sterile white of an office cubicle. "Father." The greeting was respectful, distant. "Ji-hoon, you look tired." Min-jun's own voice sounded stiff, unused. "Busy quarter, father. You know how it is." A pause. "Listen, about Chuseok." Min-jun felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a cold premonition. He kept his face impassive. "Yes? We won't be able to make it this year." Again. Ji-hoon rushed the words out. "Work is just impossible, and the flights, maybe next year." Next year. The words hung in the digital space between them. Min-jun looked past his son's image at the reflection of his own stern face in the dark screen. He saw the deep lines etched between his brows, lines of worry, or perhaps just disapproval. He had prided himself on his stoicism, his intellectual control. But the familiar excuse, the repeated deferral, landed like a small, sharp stone in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just the missed holiday, the empty seat at a table laid for one. It was the confirmation of distance, the widening gulf he felt powerless to bridge. "I see," Min-jun said, his voice level. "Work is important. Thanks for understanding, father." Relief washed over Ji-hoon's face too quickly. "I have to run to a meeting. Take care of yourself. Eat well." "You too, Ji-hoon." The screen went black. The silence rushed back in, heavier this time, thick with unspoken things. He sat motionless, the pale sunlight creeping across the polished wooden floor. The fortress felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The carefully constructed order of his days suddenly seemed brittle, a thin veneer over a profound and unsettling loneliness. The ticking of the clock was louder now, each tock a reminder of time passing, of connections fraying, of a life narrowing down to this single silent room. Was this it? Was this the dignified solitude he had envisioned for his later years, or was it simply being left behind? A crack had appeared in the smooth facade of his composure, small, almost invisible, but undeniably there. The next morning, the routine felt different. The tea tasted bland, the newspaper headlines seemed irrelevant. An unfamiliar restlessness stirred within him. He put down his book, the dense prose suddenly failing to hold his attention. On impulse, he put on his slightly worn blazer, straightened his collar, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. He walked his usual route through the winding alleys of Bukchon, past the elegant tiled roofs and sturdy wooden doors of the Hanoks, but today he saw them differently. He noticed the small signs of life he usually ignored, a pot of bright red peppers drying on a windowsill, the cheerful chatter spilling from an open window, the intricate patterns of the stone walls. His steps slowed as he neared a small, unassuming tea-house tucked away in a quieter lane. Dale Chajib, Azalea Tea House. He'd passed it countless times, dismissing it as one of the quaint establishments catering to tourists or ladies with too much time on their hands. But today the scent of roasting tea leaves drifted out, warm and inviting. Through the clean glass window he saw a woman inside, moving with quiet grace behind a simple wooden counter. She looked to be in her late 60s, her hair tied back neatly, her face serene. He hesitated. Entering felt like a deviation, a disruption of his carefully guarded solitude. But the restlessness pushed him. He slid open the wooden door, the movement smooth and silent, and stepped inside. The interior was small and intimate, filled with the warm scent of tea and wood. Simple pottery lined the shelves, and a few low tables sat on the polished floor. The woman behind the counter looked up, her eyes calm and observant. She offered a slight, polite bow. "Welcome." A green tea, please," Minjun managed, feeling oddly conspicuous. He chose a table near the window, sitting stiffly. He watched as the woman, Kim Sora, as he later learned her name was, prepared his tea. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, each scoop of the leaves, each pour of the hot water, performed with a quiet focus that bordered on reverence. He found himself analysing her technique, efficient perhaps, but lacking the intellectual rigour he valued. Sentimentality, he thought dismissively, yet he couldn't deny the soothing quality of the ritual. Sora placed the small steaming cup before him. "Please enjoy," she said softly, her voice gentle. The tea was exceptional, delicate, fragrant, with a clean finish. He sipped it slowly, the warmth spreading through him. He stayed longer than intended, observing the quiet rhythm of the tea house. A young couple came in, whispering happily. An older woman sat alone, reading a book. Sora moved between them, refilling cups, offering quiet words, her presence a calming anchor. Minjun felt a strange mix of skepticism and reluctant comfort. This place, this woman's simple contentment, it was illogical, unstructured, yet undeniably peaceful. He left without saying much beyond a curt thank you, but the memory of the tea house, its quiet warmth and Sora's unhurried grace, lingered. He found himself returning the next day and the day after, drawn by something he couldn't quite name, something that chipped away ever so slightly at the edges of his self-imposed isolation. His old smartphone, a relic from a previous technological era, finally surrendered. One morning it simply refused to turn on, its screen remaining stubbornly black. Minjun stared at it, a surge of irritation rising. He relied on it for basic calls, for the weather forecast, for the illusion of connection during those brief video calls with Ji-hoon. Now it was just a useless brick. He considered buying a similar, simple model, but a fleeting image of Ji-hoon's exasperated expression during their last call. "Father, you really need to learn how to use these things properly," surfaced. He also recalled Sora mentioning casually how she enjoyed seeing photos her daughter sent from Busan on her phone. The thought of navigating a modern smartphone with its endless apps and confusing icons filled him with dread. It represented everything he disliked about the modern world, its frantic pace, its superficiality, its demand for constant adaptation. It felt like a surrender. Yet the black screen in his hand felt like another form of isolation, a tangible cutting off. With a sigh that felt disproportionately heavy, he made a decision that went against every instinct. He would go to the local community centre. He'd seen a flyer advertising free smartphone classes for seniors. The idea was mortifying. Professor Park Minjun, seeking help with a gadget designed for teenagers. The community centre buzzed with an energy that felt alien to him. Bright fluorescent lights glared overhead, contrasting sharply with the soft natural light of his hanok. Seniors were engaged in various activities. Cheerful calligraphy classes, boisterous singing groups, intense games of baduk. He felt acutely out of place, a monochrome figure in a brightly coloured world. He found the small room designated for tech support. A young man with bright eyes and an energetic smile looked up from a laptop. "Hello. Can I help you?" My phone is broken," Minjun stated, placing the defunct device on the table as if it were evidence in a trial. "I require assistance in acquiring and learning to operate a new one." His voice was formal, stiff. The young man, Lee Han-gyul, beamed. Absolutely. We can definitely help with that. Choosing a new phone, setting it up, learning the basics. No problem. His enthusiasm was almost overwhelming. The process was excruciating. Han-gyul patiently explained options, processors, screen resolutions, terms that felt like a foreign language. Min-jun, accustomed to being the authority, felt his intellectual pride prickle as he struggled to follow. He finally settled on a standard model, feeling a pang of resentment at the expense. The lessons began. Han-gyul was endlessly patient, but Min-jun's fingers felt clumsy on the smooth touchscreen. Swiping, tapping, pinching, it felt undignified, imprecise. He accidentally opened apps, changed settings, muted the volume. Han-gyul would gently correct him, his cheerfulness unwavering. It's okay, Ruthen. Everyone finds it tricky at first. Think of it like learning a new grammar. Min-jun bristled inwardly at the comparison, but held his tongue. He struggled with the concept of apps, the cloud, notifications. He particularly detested emojis. What is the semiotic significance of this yellow weeping face? He demanded, pointing at the screen. Han-gyul blinked, then grinned. It just means really sad? Or sometimes funny sad? Min-jun sighed. Frivolous, illogical. Yet Han-gyul showed him how to make video calls. He managed a test call to Han-gyul's phone, seeing the young man's face light up on his own screen. Then Han-gyul showed him how to receive and view photos. He imagined seeing Ji-hoon's child, not as a blurry image on a laptop, but clearly, right here in his hand. A flicker of motivation ignited within his frustration. He needed to master this infernal device. Not for its own sake, but for that fragile thread connecting him to Toronto. He persisted, returning for more lessons, his pride warring constantly with his growing need. He even started, grudgingly, to appreciate Han-gyul's unwavering optimism and respect, so different from the casual indifference he sometimes felt from the younger generation. His visits to Dalai Chajib became a fixture, a quiet counterpoint to the frustrating tech lessons. He rarely spoke much, but Sora seemed to understand his need for silence. Sometimes she would offer a simple observation about the changing leaves outside or the way the light fell across the room. One afternoon, as she served him a fragrant chrysanthemum tea, she remarked softly, "This tea reminds me of my late husband. He loved chrysanthemums in the autumn." It was a simple statement, devoid of self-pity, offered gently. Min-jun, normally adept at deflecting personal disclosures, found himself responding before he could censor himself. "My wife, Yoon-hee, she preferred magnolias in the spring." Sora nodded, her eyes holding a quiet understanding. "Spring has its own beauty, but autumn teaches acceptance, don't you think? Letting go like the leaves." He considered this. Acceptance. Letting go. Concepts he understood intellectually but struggled with viscerally. He wanted to dissect her statement, analyze its philosophical underpinnings, but looking at her calm face, he simply nodded. Perhaps. Slowly, awkwardly, fragments of conversation began to emerge. He learned Sora had run the tea house for 20 years, taking it over after her husband passed away. She spoke of her daughter in Busan, of the simple pleasure she found in the ritual of tea, in tending the small plants that adorned the shop. He, in turn, found himself mentioning a particular poem or a historical detail about Bukchon, surprised when Sora listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that weren't merely polite. He initially tried to impress her with his erudition, quoting classical poets, but gradually realized her wisdom operated on a different frequency, grounded, intuitive, rooted in lived experience rather than abstract knowledge. He began to feel a grudging respect and something akin to ease in her presence. The tea house became less a place of observation and more a quiet refuge. Meanwhile, his relationship with Han-gyul also evolved subtly beyond master and reluctant pupil. Han-gyul, discovering Min-jun was a literature professor, occasionally asked shy questions about poetry or history during lulls in their tech sessions. Min-jun, initially dismissive, found himself softening, sharing anecdotes or explaining concepts, surprised by the young man's genuine curiosity. He even managed, after much internal debate and practice swipes, to send Han-gyul a thank you message, text only, no emojis, after a particularly helpful session. Han-gyul's delighted response, "Wow, Yurasin, you're getting good," brought an unexpected, fleeting warmth. These small interactions, these tentative connections, were like tiny streams slowly eroding the rock face of his solitude. One rainy afternoon, confined indoors, Minjun decided to tackle the clutter in his study. He opened a large camphor wood chest he hadn't touched since Yoonhee passed. Inside, beneath stacks of old academic papers, were photo albums and bundles of letters tied with ribbon. He hesitated, a familiar ache tightening his chest. He hadn't looked at these since the funeral. Steeling himself, he lifted out an album. There they were. Eunhee, young and vibrant, smiling shyly on their wedding day. Ji-hoon as a chubby toddler, taking his first steps in their old apartment courtyard. Himself, younger, thinner, his face serious even then, standing beside Yoonhee on a university trip, her hand tucked lightly in his arm. He traced her smiling face with a trembling finger. Regret washed over him, sharp and bitter. He remembered countless evenings when she had tried to draw him out of his study, suggesting a walk, a movie, a simple conversation, only for him to plead the pressure of deadlines, the importance of his research. He had prioritized his intellect, his ambition, over the quiet, steady warmth she offered. He saw it clearly now, the imbalance of their life together, his emotional distance masked as academic dedication. He picked up a packet of her letters, written during a brief period when he had studied abroad decades ago. Her handwriting was neat, flowing, full of everyday details, expressions of affection, gentle inquiries about his well-being. They were simple letters, full of a warmth he hadn't fully appreciated then. He read them slowly, the rain drumming softly against the window pane, tears blurring the ink. It wasn't just sadness he felt, but a profound sense of loss for the connection he had failed to nurture adequately while she was alive. Yet amidst the regret, there was also a rekindling of warmth, a reminder of the love that had existed, however imperfectly expressed. He spent the rest of the afternoon lost in memories, not suppressing the grief this time, but allowing it to wash through him, acknowledging the depth of his loss and the contours of his past mistakes. It was painful, exhausting, but strangely cleansing. He was confronting his past, not as a series of academic footnotes, but as lived felt experience. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his perception began to shift. He started noticing things beyond the confines of his intellect. Walking to the tea house, he paused to admire the deep crimson of maple leaves scattered on the cobblestones. He registered the earthy smell after the rain, the cheerful cry of a street vendor selling roasted chestnuts. At Dale Chajib, he savoured the delicate bitterness of the green tea, the subtle sweetness of the jujube tea Sora sometimes offered, noticing the unique shape and glaze of each ceramic cup. He even found himself attempting one of the mindfulness exercises Hanjol had briefly mentioned, focusing on his breath for a minute while waiting for his phone to charge. His mind still raced, cluttered with analysis and critique, but for brief moments he experienced a flicker of simple presence. He tried initiating a video call with Ji-hoon using his new skills. It was still awkward. He fumbled with the icons, accidentally turning the camera towards the ceiling. But when he finally got Ji-hoon on screen, he managed to ask about his grandchild by name, relaying a simple observation about the changing season in Seoul. Ji-hoon seemed surprised, then pleased. He shared a short video of the child laughing. Seeing the small face clearly on his screen, hearing the sound of her joy, Minjun felt a genuine, uncomplicated warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't a profound connection yet, but it was a start. A fragile bridge built with clumsy taps on a glass screen. He was learning not just how to use a phone, but how to reach across the distance in small, tentative ways. He wouldn't have called it happiness, not yet, but it was a lessening of the bleakness, a quiet infusion of possibility into the monochrome landscape of his days. Winter settled over Bukchon. Bare branches laced intricate patterns against the grey sky, and the air held a sharp chill. Minjun continued his routine, but it felt less rigid, punctuated by the quiet warmth of the tea house and the occasional still slightly awkward tech consultations with Hangyol. He'd even mastered sending photos, carefully curated shots of his courtyard garden dusted with frost, or a particularly elegant roofline against the winter sky. One crisp afternoon, sitting in Dale Chajib, watching Sora carefully tend to a small orchid near the window, he found himself thinking about resilience. This quiet woman, running her small business alone, finding solace in simple rituals, seemed to possess a strength he, with all his intellectual fortifications, lacked. That orchid, he remarked, surprising himself with the observation. "It seems fragile, yet it blooms even in winter." Sora looked up, a gentle smile touching her lips. "It needs care, Professor. The right light, just enough water. Not too much, not too little. Like many things, I suppose." She paused, then added softly, "Sometimes the strongest things look delicate." Her words resonated. He thought of Yunhee's quiet strength, the resilience he hadn't fully recognized. He thought of his own brittleness, his resistance to change that felt less like strength and more like fear. He had started reading poetry again, not for critical analysis, but allowing the words to evoke feeling, something he hadn't done since his student days. He found himself drawn to poets who spoke of nature, of acceptance, of the quiet passage of time. The climax arrived not with a dramatic event, but with another phone call, just weeks before Solal, the Lunar New Year. Ji-hoon's face appeared on the screen, looking more stressed than usual. "Father, hi." He rubbed his temples. "Look, things are really chaotic here. A big project deadline moved up. I don't think I can make the trip for Solal." He avoided Minjun's gaze. "I'm really sorry. Maybe in the summer." The old script surged within Minjun. The familiar sting of disappointment, the reflexive urge to retreat into wounded silence or offer a cutting remark about priorities, about filial duty. He could feel the cynical words forming. "Summer like next year's Chuseok? Some promises are easily made." His jaw tightened. He saw his own reflection in the phone's dark screen, the stern, judgmental elder he was becoming. But then something shifted. A memory surfaced. Sora talking about her daughter's busy life in Busan, her voice tinged not with resentment, but with understanding. "She works so hard," Sora had said simply. Another image flashed. Han-gyol, looking tired after pulling an all-nighter for his university exams, still showing up cheerful to help the seniors. The pressures of modern life, the demands Ji-hoon faced, perhaps they weren't just excuses. Perhaps they were real. He took a slow breath, consciously relaxing his jaw. The internal battle was fierce but brief. He made a choice. "Ji-hoon," he said, his voice quieter than usual, perhaps a little rough. "It sounds like you are under a lot of pressure." Ji-hoon looked up, startled, clearly expecting criticism. Yes, Father. It's been intense." "Take care of yourself," Minjun continued, the words feeling foreign but necessary. "Don't worry about us here. Focus on your work. We can connect like this." He gestured vaguely at the phone. "It is better than nothing." A wave of surprise, then relief, softened Ji-hoon's features. "Thank you, Father. Really, that means a lot." There was a warmth in his son's voice Minjun hadn't heard in a long time. "I'll call you properly on Solal morning, okay?" "Yes, do that." Minjun ended the call, his hands slightly trembling. He felt drained, but also strangely light. He hadn't performed a grand gesture, hadn't suddenly become effusive or emotional. He had simply chosen understanding over judgment, connection over pride. It was a small victory, fought and won entirely within the quiet battlefield of his own mind. But it felt significant, like shifting a heavy stone that had blocked his path for years. He looked out the window at the stark winter branches. Perhaps, he thought, even in winter, something new could begin to grow. Seollal dawned crisp and clear. The usual festive bustle of the city seemed muted within the quiet alleys of Bukchon. Minjun woke feeling not the familiar pang of loneliness, but a quiet sense of calm. Ji-hoon called as promised. The video connection was stable. They talked for longer than usual. Ji-hoon apologized again, but his tone was relaxed, appreciative. He showed Minjun his granddaughter, who waved shyly at the screen. Minjun managed a warm, if slightly awkward, greeting. The conversation still had its pauses, its moments of formality, but the underlying tension had eased. It felt like a conversation, not just a report. Later that morning, he walked to Dale Chajib. Sora was open, offering complimentary teok, rice cakes, and tea to her regulars. He sat at his usual table, accepting a small plate of colourful, sticky rice cakes and a steaming cup of barley tea. "Happy New Year, Professor," Sora greeted him warmly. "Happy New Year, Sorasi," he replied, the title feeling natural now. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the occasional neighbour pass by, dressed in colourful hanbok. He didn't feel the need to fill the silence with intellectual discourse. The shared quiet, the simple ritual of tea and rice cake felt sufficient. In the afternoon, back in his hanok, he picked up his smartphone. He navigated the menus with newfound confidence, finding the photo gallery. He scrolled through the pictures Ji-hoon had sent, his granddaughter's birthday party, a snowy park in Toronto, Ji-hoon smiling